Think junk food is a modern invention? Medieval Europe had their own version of fast food that might surprise you. This is the untold story of history's first snack culture, from apple fritters that could burn your tongue to cheese curds that squeaked. But some of these medieval treats were so bizarre, they'd make today's weirdest food trends look absolutely normal. These forgotten flavors reveal how our ancestors found joy and comfort in the harshest times, creating food traditions that secretly shaped modern cuisine. Tonight, let these gentle stories of ancient kitchens and distant dreams carry you peacefully into sleep. What if I told you that junk food existed long before McDonald's ever dreamed of golden arches? Before vending machines hummed in office hallways, before food trucks lined city streets, people were already finding ways to snack, to indulge, to grab something quick and satisfying on the go. Tonight, we're traveling back to a world that might seem impossibly distant, yet surprisingly familiar. A world where the pursuit of a good snack was just as real as it is today. Picture medieval Europe in the 1300s. No drive-thrus, no convenience stores, no refrigeration. Most meals were practical affairs involving cabbage pretending to be other things, porridge that had seen better days, and bread tough enough to use as building material. Water was often questionable, meat was a luxury, and sugar was so rare and expensive it doubled as a social status symbol. Yet even in this world of scarcity and struggle, the human spirit found ways to create something special, something that brought joy to an otherwise harsh existence. This is where we find ourselves tonight, walking through muddy market squares and cobblestone streets, breathing in the smoky air of wood fires and roasting meat. The people we'll meet aren't so different from us. They worked hard, worried about their families, and at the end of a long day, they craved something that would lift their spirits. They were innovators, taking whatever ingredients they could find and transforming them into moments of pure pleasure. The challenge was real and immediate. How do you create something delicious when your pantry consists of whatever grew behind the alehouse? When your cooking oil has been reused so many times it could practically vote, and when the concept of food safety is still centuries away? How do you find sweetness in a world where honey is precious and imported sugar costs more than most people earn in a month? How do you make something crispy and golden when your oven is basically a hole in the ground with a fire in it? This is the story of medieval ingenuity, of people who refused to let difficult circumstances dim their appetite for something wonderful. And it begins with apples, not the perfect, polished spheres you find in modern supermarkets, but small, tart, knobby little things that grew wild and free. Apples that may or may not have been borrowed from a neighbor's tree under the cover of darkness. Because when you're craving something sweet, property lines become somewhat negotiable. Someone, somewhere in medieval Europe, looked at these humble apples and had a brilliant idea. What if we chopped them up, mixed them into a rough batter, and fried them in bubbling fat until they turned golden and crispy? What if we could capture the essence of sweetness and wrap it in a crunchy, warm embrace that would make people forget, at least for a moment, about everything else troubling their medieval lives? The process was both simple and magical. Apples were chopped with whatever knife was sharp enough for the job, then tossed into a batter made of flour, eggs, and often ale, because water was always a gamble and ale made everything feel slightly more cheerful. The mixture was rough, imperfect, but full of possibility. Then came the moment of transformation. Into the hot fat it went, usually pig fat that had been recycled more times than anyone cared to count, adding its own complex layers of flavor. What emerged from that bubbling cauldron was nothing short of medieval magic. Apple fritters, golden and crispy on the outside, soft and tender within, carrying the sweet tart burst of fruit and the satisfying crunch of fried batter. They were hot enough to burn your tongue if you were too eager, but worth every moment of patience it took to let them cool just enough to bite into safely. The lucky and wealthy might dust their fritters with imported sugar, a luxury that sparkled like edible diamonds and announced to everyone within sight that you had money to spare. For everyone else, a drizzle of honey or spiced syrup did the trick beautifully, adding sweetness and sophistication to what was essentially peasant food elevated to an art form. Either way, the result was something magical enough to distract you from whatever else was on your plate, which was usually some variation of cabbage. These weren't restaurant desserts or carefully plated delicacies. Apple fritters were street food in its purest form. You'd grab one at the weekly market, after church services, when your soul felt light and your pocket had a few coins to spare, or during the excitement of a village fair, when the air was filled with music and laughter and the possibility of small adventures. Children's eyes would light up at the sight of them. Adults would allow themselves this one indulgence. Even the birds would scheme and plot, diving in for whatever crumbs they could steal. The experience was communal and immediate. Vendors would call out from their stalls, waving fresh fritters still glistening with oil and dusted with sweetness. The smell would draw you in before you even realized you were hungry. You'd hand over your coins, receive your treasure wrapped in a piece of cloth or a large leaf, and find a spot to savor this moment of pure pleasure. Were they perfect? Absolutely not. Sometimes the apples were more sour than sweet, making your face pucker in surprise. Sometimes the batter was suspiciously chewy, or the oil temperature wasn't quite right, leaving you with something either burnt on the outside and raw within, or soggy and disappointing. Sometimes you'd bite down expecting fruit and find mostly batter, or vice versa. But when they were good, they were transcendent. One bite would transport you from whatever troubles filled your day to a moment of pure sensory joy. The contrast of textures, the burst of sweetness, the warmth spreading through your chest, the way the flavors seemed to awaken every taste bud and remind you that life, despite its hardships, still held beautiful surprises. This was more than food. This was proof that human creativity and the desire for pleasure could triumph over the most challenging circumstances. In a world where most people spent their days focused on mere survival, apple fritters represented something precious. The determination to find joy, to create beauty, to transform the ordinary into something extraordinary. Standing there in that medieval marketplace, grease on your fingers and sweetness on your tongue, you could understand why people put up with everything else medieval life threw at them. Because in that moment, biting into a perfectly fried apple fritter while the sounds of the market swirled around you, life felt not just bearable, but actually wonderful. But this golden, crispy revelation was just the beginning of our journey through the forgotten flavors of yesterday. Just the first taste of how our ancestors turned scarcity into celebration, one delicious bite at a time. Popcorn that squeaks. That's the closest modern comparison to one of medieval Europe's most beloved snacks, though even that doesn't quite capture the peculiar charm of cheese curds. These weren't flashy treats trying to win Instagram followers or impress dinner party guests. They didn't melt dramatically or stretch into photogenic strings. In fact, they barely did anything at all, which is exactly what made them perfect for their time and place in history. If apple fritters were the medieval equivalent of donuts, then cheese curds were something like medieval popcorn, bite-sized, oddly satisfying, and wildly inconsistent from batch to batch. They were the friend who never tried to be the star of the show, but somehow always ended up being exactly what you needed when everything else was falling apart around you. Let's be absolutely clear about something important. Medieval cheese wasn't aiming for perfection or Instagram-worthy presentations. This was cheese made fast, eaten faster, and expected to survive long journeys on horseback, questionable storage conditions in damp cellars, and the occasional goat stepping on it, because barn security wasn't exactly a priority in the 14th century. Medieval cheese was practical, sturdy, and built to last, much like everything else in that unforgiving world. Cheese curds were essentially baby cheese, the early fresh bits that appeared before the wheel hardened into something that could legitimately double as building material or a weapon if the situation called for it. These little clumps of dairy joy were a natural byproduct of the cheese-making process, which means they were born from necessity rather than culinary ambition. When farmers separated milk into curds and whey using rennet, which sounds fancy and sophisticated until you realize it came from the stomach lining of a baby animal, those first tender curds were too good to waste. The process was both ancient and surprisingly complex. Farmers would heat fresh milk, add the rennet, and wait for that moment of transformation when liquid became solid, when chaos became order, when something ordinary became something magical. The curds were then pressed lightly, salted with whatever salt was available, and that was it. No aging, no complex procedures, no temperature-controlled environments. Just cheese curds, ready to eat, simple as that. Sometimes they were soft and yielding, melting on your tongue like a whispered promise of richness. Sometimes they were rubbery and challenging, requiring serious jaw commitment and possibly some advanced planning. And sometimes, wonderfully and mysteriously, they squeaked against your teeth like they had developed their own personality during the fermentation process, a quirky little announcement of their freshness and vitality. But regardless of their texture or sound effects, cheese curds were deeply satisfying in a way that transcended their humble origins. They were filling without being heavy, portable without being messy, and protein-rich in a world where protein was often scarce. In an era where your typical snack might be old bread dunked in whatever liquid was available, or cold broth if you were feeling fancy, cheese curds felt like a genuine win for your taste buds and your stomach. The monastic communities absolutely loved them. Monks, with their dedication to self-sufficiency and their access to dairy cows, became some of the most skilled cheese curd producers in medieval Europe. They had the time, the patience, and the religious conviction that everything, even cheese, should be made with care and attention to detail. Monastery cheese curds developed reputations that spread far beyond their walls, and travelers would sometimes plan their journeys specifically to coincide with fresh batch days. Travelers of all sorts packed cheese curds for their journeys because they understood something fundamental about medieval travel. You never knew when your next real meal would appear, and having something nutritious and satisfying in your pack could mean the difference between arriving at your destination in good spirits or stumbling in half-starved and irritable. Cheese curds didn't spoil quickly. They didn't require heating or special preparation, and they provided steady energy for long days on horseback or on foot. Children treated them like candy, assuming the cows had been cooperative that particular week and the milk supply was steady. There was something deeply appealing about these little nuggets of richness, something that satisfied a child's need for both nutrition and pleasure. Parents appreciated them too, because they were one of the few snacks that actually contributed to a child's health rather than undermining it. You could eat cheese curds exactly as they were, savoring their simple, clean flavor and that distinctive squeak that announced their freshness to anyone within hearing distance. Or you could get creative with them. Fry them lightly in a pan with a bit of fat, and they transformed into golden, crispy treasures with molten centers. Crumble them over stews and soups, and they added richness and substance to what might otherwise be thin, disappointing broths. Toss them into bread dough before baking, and you created a hearty loaf that could sustain you through the longest, most demanding days. Unlike many medieval foods that required special occasions, feast days, or religious holidays to justify their consumption, cheese curds were refreshingly democratic. They weren't saved for celebrations or reserved for saints' days. They were just there, reliable and comforting, mildly chewy and pleasantly salty. The culinary equivalent of a friend who always shows up when needed, never demands attention or praise, but somehow makes everything better just by being present. Did they sometimes taste a little off? Certainly. Freshness existed on a spectrum in the Middle Ages, and that spectrum was considerably broader and more forgiving than what we might accept today. But with enough salt, enough enthusiasm, and the realistic expectations that came from living in a world without refrigeration, most people didn't spend much time complaining about minor variations in flavor or texture. Besides, in a world where your other snack options might include turnips masquerading as dessert, or bread so stale it required soaking in ale just to become chewable, cheese curds were genuinely exciting. They had flavor, substance, and that appealing element of unpredictability. You never knew exactly what you were going to get with each batch, but you knew it would be satisfying. They were also remarkably useful for purposes beyond simple snacking. Cheese curds turned out to be excellent currency for bribing cats, which was more important than it might sound in a world where cats were your primary defense against grain-destroying rodents. They worked equally well for negotiating with small children. Whether you were trying to convince them to behave during long church services or to help with farm chores without complaining. The beauty of cheese curds lay in their complete lack of pretension. They weren't trying to be anything other than what they were: simple, nourishing, mildly entertaining bits of dairy that made daily life a little more pleasant. They represented the medieval approach to food at its most practical and honest. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated, just good basic sustenance with enough character to keep things interesting. As evening settled over those medieval farms and monasteries, as the day's work wound down and families gathered around their simple tables, cheese curds often appeared as the conclusion to modest meals. They were the period at the end of the sentence, the small but satisfying finish to whatever else had been available that day. Children would pop them into their mouths one by one, savoring each squeak and burst of flavor. Adults would eat them more thoughtfully, appreciating their substance and their role in making the meal feel complete. So while cheese curds weren't glamorous or sophisticated, they were undeniably important. They were simple, hearty, and just indulgent enough to count as a genuine treat. They connected people to their livestock, to their land, and to the fundamental satisfaction that comes from transforming raw materials into something nourishing and enjoyable. In a world that often felt unpredictable and harsh, cheese curds offered reliability, comfort, and that distinctive squeak that somehow made everything feel just a little bit more cheerful. But even as cheese curds provided their squeaky comfort to medieval families, another snack was developing in kitchens and alehouses across Europe. One that would take the concept of transforming leftovers into something wonderful to entirely new levels. Because when yesterday's bread met today's ale, magic happened in the most unexpected ways. Turnips are not dessert. Let's just start there. There's no getting around this fundamental truth. No amount of medieval creativity or desperate optimism that can change the basic nature of what a turnip is and what it aspires to be. And yet, in the medieval world, where sugar was more precious than silver, apples weren't always in season, and creative desperation was practically its own food group, someone somewhere looked at a humble turnip and thought, what if this were pie? And so, against all logic and culinary common sense, the turnip pie was born. Now, To be completely fair to our medieval ancestors, it wasn't always awful. Sometimes, under the right circumstances, with the right cook, and perhaps a touch of divine intervention, it was even kind of good. The key was understanding that you weren't eating dessert in any sense that we would recognize today. You were eating hope wrapped in pastry, optimism baked into a crust, the culinary equivalent of making the best of a challenging situation. Think of it this way. You have turnips, lots of them, because turnips were reliable, hardy, and grew even when other crops failed. They stored well through the winter, they were cheap to produce, and they were filling, which in medieval terms meant they checked all the important boxes. The problem was that turnips, while nutritious and practical, had all the natural sweetness and dessert potential of a wooden spoon. But medieval cooks were nothing if not resourceful, and they understood something fundamental about the transformative power of pastry, honey, and sheer determination. The process began with turnips, hopefully tender ones that hadn't spent too many months in cold storage developing that particular root vegetable bitterness that could clear a room. These were mashed, hopefully into something resembling a smooth consistency, though smooth was a relative concept when your kitchen tools consisted of whatever wooden implements you could fashion or afford. The mashed turnips were then blended with eggs, which added richness and helped bind everything together. And if the cook was feeling generous or the household was celebrating something special, maybe some honey or dried fruit would make an appearance. The honey was crucial because it provided the sweetness that turnips so dramatically lacked. A little went a long way, and since honey was precious, cooks learned to use just enough to transform the mixture from livestock feed to potentially edible dessert substitute. Dried fruit, when available, added both sweetness and texture, little bursts of concentrated flavor that helped distract from the fact that you were essentially eating sweetened root vegetables. All of this mixture was then carefully spooned into a pie crust, which was where the real magic happened. Medieval pie crusts were substantial affairs made from flour, water, and what we might generously call ambition. These weren't delicate, flaky pastries designed to melt in your mouth. They were sturdy, practical constructions built to contain whatever needed containing and to hold up under challenging circumstances. The crust was both container and camouflage, transforming whatever was inside into something that looked, from the outside at least, like it belonged on a respectable table. The baking process was its own adventure. Medieval ovens were essentially controlled fires in stone or clay chambers, with temperatures that fluctuated based on the weather, the quality of the fuel, and the baker's skill at managing the flames. The turnip pie went in as an act of faith and came out as whatever the cooking gods decided it should become. Sometimes it emerged golden and fragrant, with the turnips transformed into something surprisingly pleasant. Sometimes it came out looking like a construction project that had gone slightly wrong. When done well, turnip pie was warm, mildly sweet, and had that vaguely comforting root vegetable meets pudding vibe that could actually be quite satisfying on a cold evening when your other options were limited. The honey added enough sweetness to convince your taste buds that something dessert-like was happening, while the egg provided richness and the crust gave the whole experience a sense of occasion. It wasn't cheesecake, but it tried, and in medieval Europe, trying counted for a lot. When done poorly, it tasted exactly like what it was: root vegetables that had been convinced to participate in a dessert they had no business being part of. No amount of cinnamon or nutmeg could completely hide the fundamental turnipness of the filling, and the result was something that made you appreciate whatever else might be on the table, even if that was just more bread and ale. Turnip pies were popular for two main practical reasons. First, turnips were incredibly cheap, available even when other ingredients were scarce, and could be stored for months without spoiling. Second, pie crust could hide a multitude of sins, both culinary and aesthetic. Whether the turnips were slightly overripe, undercooked, or had developed that particular bitter edge that turnips sometimes acquired, once you baked them into a pie and added a generous drizzle of honey, it became peasant cuisine with genuine aspirations. You'd find these pies at village fairs, where vendors would hawk them alongside more conventional treats, often to customers who were either very hungry or very drunk. Both states that made turnip pie seem considerably more appealing. They appeared on feast tables, not as the centerpiece, but as a practical dessert that could feed a lot of people without breaking anyone's budget. They were especially popular in monasteries where the monks had time, turnips, and the kind of patient optimism that comes from believing in the possibility of transformation, both spiritual and culinary. Some enterprising cooks added spices to elevate the experience. Nutmeg, if the abbey was wealthy enough to afford it, could add warmth and complexity. Pepper, if the cook was feeling adventurous or slightly chaotic, brought an unexpected kick that either enhanced the overall experience or confused it entirely. Occasionally, raisins made an appearance, which only added to the identity crisis that was already happening on the plate. Nobles generally didn't eat turnip pie unless they were making some kind of political statement about relating to the common folk, or unless they were slumming it for entertainment, the medieval equivalent of trying street food for the thrill of it. But for everyone else, for the farmers and laborers and monastery residents, turnip pie was dessert, sort of. It was an afterthought with pastry, a sweet ending to a meal that needed something to mark its conclusion. The truly remarkable thing about turnip pie wasn't that it existed, but that it endured. People continued making it, eating it, and apparently enjoying it enough to pass the recipes down through generations. It appeared in household manuscripts, monastery records, and feast descriptions. Despite its questionable logic and dubious ingredients, turnip pie had staying power that spoke to something deeper than mere hunger. It represented the medieval spirit at its most determined and creative. When life gives you turnips, apparently, you make pie. When sugar is too expensive and fruit is out of season, you find ways to create sweetness anyway. When your options are limited and your resources are scarce, you transform what you have into something that brings a little joy to the table, even if that joy requires a certain amount of imagination and goodwill. And perhaps that's what made turnip pie genuinely special. Not its flavor or its texture or its resemblance to what we might consider proper dessert, but its representation of human resilience and creativity. It was cheap, filling, and mildly sweet, which by medieval standards made it practically revolutionary. It proved that even the humblest ingredients could be elevated, that even the most unlikely combinations could work, and that sometimes the attempt to create something wonderful was more important than the final result. As we leave the world of turnip pies behind, with their earnest attempts at sweetness and their stubborn insistence on being dessert despite all evidence to the contrary, we moved toward snacks that required considerably more courage to consume, portable meals that came with their own built-in sense of adventure and just a touch of genuine danger. If the medieval world had a comfort food MVP, it would have been the meat pasty, a handheld pie stuffed with seasoned meat, tucked into a folded crust, and baked until it was golden brown or slightly scorched, depending on the baker's skill and the oven's mood on any given day. Basically, this was a medieval hot pocket, minus the microwave, and plus a genuine sense of danger that came from never being entirely certain what you were about to bite into. The beauty of the meat pasty was its pure, unapologetic portability. You could eat it on the road while traveling between villages, in the fields during harvest time when every daylight hour mattered, or while watching a public execution if that happened to be the day's entertainment. Wrapped in its thick pastry crust, a good pasty stayed warm for hours and protected its contents from dirt, rain, curious rats, and the occasional peasant sneeze that was just part of life in crowded medieval spaces. But let's talk honestly about that filling, because meat in this context was what we might generously call a flexible term. If you lived near a manor house or a hunting estate, if you had connections or coin, or simply good timing, you might find yourself biting into actual, recognizable meat. Pork from well-fed pigs, mutton from sheep that had lived decent lives, or venison from deer that had been running free through noble forests just days before. These were the premium pasties, the ones that made you close your eyes and savor every bite, because you knew this level of quality wouldn't come around again anytime soon. But for most people, most of the time, the definition of meat expanded dramatically based on availability, season, and what we might politely call creative necessity. Rabbit, certainly, when the hunting was good and the rabbits were careless. Pigeon, which was plentiful and didn't require much skill to catch, especially the young ones that hadn't yet learned to be properly suspicious of humans. Eel, for those near rivers and streams, slippery and strange, but surprisingly flavorful when properly prepared. And then there were the more adventurous options. Hedgehog, which was considered quite the delicacy when prepared correctly, with a flavor that was supposedly somewhere between pork and chicken, though few people had enough experience with hedgehog to make reliable comparisons. The truth was that anything that had once moved under its own power could potentially find its way into a meat pasty. The medieval approach to protein was refreshingly comprehensive and utterly practical. If it had legs, wings, fins, or even if it just slithered around effectively, it could be diced, seasoned, and hidden inside pastry with what we might call plausible deniability. The thick crust and generous seasoning meant that even the most unusual ingredients could be transformed into something recognizably delicious, or at least recognizably edible. Spices played a crucial role in this culinary alchemy, though their primary function wasn't always to enhance flavor. Sometimes, perhaps more often than anyone wanted to admit, spices were there to distract you from flavors that had developed during the days when the meat had been resting longer than strictly ideal. Pepper, sage, and garlic were the holy trinity of medieval meat preservation and flavor enhancement. They helped, certainly, but they couldn't perform miracles, and there were limits to what even the most enthusiastic seasoning could accomplish. Still, in a time when refrigeration was pure fantasy, and your lunch options often consisted of bread and onions if you were lucky, a meat pasty felt genuinely indulgent. It was hot, it was substantial, it was greasy in the most satisfying way, and it provided the kind of sustained energy that could carry you through long days of physical labor. The fat content alone made it a valuable source of calories in a world where people burned energy at rates that would exhaust modern fitness enthusiasts. There were even vegetarian versions for fasting days or for the particularly devout, filled with root vegetables, leeks, cheese, or whatever combination of non-meat ingredients could be made to seem substantial and satisfying. These plant-based pasties had their own appeal, often featuring more complex combinations of herbs and vegetables than their meat counterparts, seasoned with whatever grew in the monastery garden or could be foraged from nearby fields and forests. But make no mistake about it, the meat versions were the crowd pleasers, the ones that drew long lines at market stalls and fair booths. They were greasy, hot, comforting, and just mysterious enough to be exciting. You didn't ask too many questions about what was inside. You didn't demand detailed ingredient lists or nutritional information. You just paid your coins, took your pasty, and hoped that whoever had prepared it had been in a good mood and working with relatively fresh ingredients. The social aspect of meat pasties was equally important. In some places, particularly among miners and laborers who worked in groups, people would mark their pasties with initials or symbols scratched into the crust before baking. This wasn't just about identifying your lunch. It was about claiming ownership of something that represented a significant portion of your daily food budget. In the crowded communal eating spaces where workers gathered, being able to identify your specific pasty was the difference between eating well and going hungry. Some regions developed the tradition of making the crust extra thick along one edge, creating a built-in handle that could be held with dirty hands and then discarded afterward. This practical innovation meant that miners could eat their lunch without worrying about coal dust or other workplace contaminants. And the discarded crust edges often found their way to local animals or, according to superstition, were left as offerings for the spirits that were believed to protect workers in dangerous professions. The preparation of meat pasties was almost ritualistic in its precision. The pastry had to be rolled thick enough to contain whatever filling awaited it, but not so thick that it overwhelmed the meat entirely. The filling needed to be seasoned generously, but not so heavily that it masked everything else. The sealing of the edges required skill and attention, because a pasty that burst open during baking was not just a culinary failure, but a genuine tragedy that wasted precious ingredients and left everyone involved hungry and disappointed. Baking was its own form of artistry, requiring careful attention to oven temperature, timing, and the subtle signs that indicated when the pastry had achieved that perfect golden brown color that promised a properly cooked interior. Too little time in the oven left you with raw pastry and lukewarm filling. Too much time resulted in a charcoal-like exterior and dried-out contents that turned the eating experience into something closer to chewing leather. When everything went right, when the stars aligned and the baker's skill met quality ingredients and a cooperative oven, a meat pasty was genuinely transcendent. The first bite would release a burst of steam, carrying the concentrated aromas of meat, herbs, and that distinctive flavor that comes from ingredients that have been sealed together and allowed to meld during the baking process. The contrast between the crispy exterior and the tender, flavorful interior created a sensory experience that made all the uncertainty and risk seem worthwhile. So were they good? Often, yes. They were genuinely delicious, satisfying in ways that transcended their humble origins and questionable ingredients. Were they mysterious? Always, because even when you thought you knew what was inside, there was always an element of surprise, always the possibility that this particular pasty might contain something unexpected, something that would make this meal memorable for reasons you hadn't anticipated. But that mystery was part of the charm, part of what made eating a meat pasty an adventure rather than just a meal. You didn't eat one to feel safe or to have your expectations met in predictable ways. You ate it because it tasted good, because it filled you up, because it provided sustenance and satisfaction, and because you were prepared to accept whatever consequences might follow. In a world where every meal carried some element of risk, where food safety was more aspiration than reality, the meat pasty represented a perfect balance of nourishment and adventure, comfort and excitement. It was food that demanded courage, rewarded faith, and occasionally surprised you with moments of genuine culinary excellence hidden inside its protective pastry shell. From these bold, mysterious handheld meals, we turn now to something that required equal courage, but in entirely different ways, moving from the realm of questionable meat to the world of medieval breath fresheners that could crack teeth and blood-based snacks that challenged both palate and constitution. In a world where brushing your teeth meant rinsing with wine and hoping for the best, candied fennel seeds were the closest thing medieval folks had to breath mints. Tiny, sugary, and vaguely herbal, they were part treat, part digestive aid, and part dental hazard, all wrapped up in a single, oddly satisfying crunch that could either freshen your mouth or send you searching for a tooth that had decided to part ways with your jaw. These little seeds were typically coated in a hard shell of sugar, which was no small feat in an era when sugar had to be imported from distant lands, boiled by hand in copper pots over wood fires, beaten into submission with wooden paddles, and poured with the kind of precision that came only from years of practice and probably a few burned fingers. Someone, somewhere, really believed in the potential of these tiny aromatic seeds, and they were willing to invest considerable time, money, and effort into transforming them into something that resembled candy. They were especially popular in noble households, where maintaining some semblance of fresh breath was considered both a social courtesy and a political necessity. After a dinner that might include 3 different types of roasted bird, an alarming quantity of aged cheese, and enough mead to float a small boat, guests would be handed small silver dishes filled with these crystallized seeds, partly to freshen their mouths, and partly to distract from whatever other aromas might be lingering from the evening's festivities. The flavor experience was, to put it mildly, intense and not entirely predictable. Fennel seeds had a strong licorice-like bite that you either embraced enthusiastically or politely endured while nodding in gratitude. The sugar coating helped considerably, providing initial sweetness that eased you into the herbal assault that followed. But there was always that unmistakable anise kick, the kind of flavor that announced itself boldly and then lingered long after you'd finished chewing, reminding you of your choice for hours afterward. Beyond their breath-freshening properties, candied fennel seeds were believed to serve important digestive functions. Medieval people, working with the medical knowledge available to them, were convinced that fennel helped settle upset stomachs, especially after meals that featured questionable meat, excessive alcohol, or that particular combination of rich foods and poor judgment that characterized most medieval feasts. Think of them as the distant ancestors of modern antacids, but with more potential to chip a tooth and considerably more character. And speaking of dental hazards, these seeds were genuinely hard, not just chewy or firm, but legitimately dangerous to anyone who approached them with overconfidence or insufficient caution. You didn't just pop a candied fennel seed into your mouth and start crunching away like it was modern candy. You tested one first, gently, exploring its resistance with your teeth. You bit down slowly, carefully, listening for any ominous cracking sounds that might indicate either the seed giving way or your dental work surrendering to superior force. Then and only then did you commit to the full chewing experience. This was genuinely a risk-reward situation every single time. The rewards could be substantial: fresh breath, settled stomach, and the satisfaction of consuming something exotic and expensive that demonstrated your access to international trade routes and disposable income. The risks were equally real: chipped teeth, jaw strain, and the possibility of encountering a particularly stubborn seed that refused to yield to normal chewing pressure and required strategic maneuvering around your mouth until you could find an angle of attack that wouldn't result in dental casualties. While wealthy nobles popped these seeds like medieval breath mints at formal dinners and court gatherings, common folk occasionally managed to get their hands on more affordable versions. These knockoff candied seeds usually involved honey instead of refined sugar, crushed local herbs instead of imported fennel, and a considerable amount of optimism about the final result. They weren't quite the same experience as the aristocratic version, but they were good enough to provide a taste of luxury and refinement to people whose daily diet consisted largely of bread, ale, and whatever vegetables hadn't rotted in storage. The preparation of authentic candied fennel seeds was almost ceremonial in its complexity and precision. First, you needed fennel seeds of the highest quality, preferably imported, and certainly more expensive than most people's monthly food budget. These seeds were then repeatedly dipped in hot sugar syrup, allowed to cool and harden, then dipped again, building up layers of crystallized sweetness like edible armor. The process required perfect timing, precise temperature control, and the kind of patience that came from knowing that rushing would ruin days of work and waste ingredients that cost more than most people earned in a week. The result was something that looked like tiny jewels, translucent and gleaming, with the fennel seed visible at the center like an insect preserved in amber. They were stored in ornate containers, displayed on special serving dishes, and offered to guests with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for much more significant occasions. To be offered candied fennel seeds was to be acknowledged as someone worthy of luxury, someone whose breath and digestive comfort mattered enough to justify the expense. But these crystallized breath fresheners were just one example of how medieval people tried to bridge the gap between necessity and luxury, between survival and comfort. As we move from the rarefied world of noble dinner parties and their breath-freshening rituals, we enter an entirely different realm of human experience, the mysterious landscape of sleep and dreams, where ancient civilizations found messages that seemed to come from the gods themselves. In the ancient world, far from the medieval dinner halls where nobles crunched their way through expensive fennel seeds, dreams weren't merely nightly entertainment or random neural firing. They were supernatural emails sent directly from divine headquarters to the human subconscious, and ignoring them was roughly equivalent to leaving a message from the gods unread, which everyone understood was both disrespectful and potentially catastrophic. By around 2500 BCE, ancient Mesopotamians had developed comprehensive systems for interpreting these nocturnal communications, recorded meticulously on clay tablets in cuneiform script that treated dream analysis with the same seriousness we might reserve for medical diagnoses or legal documents. These weren't bedtime curiosities or amusing stories to share over morning meals. They were used to guide statecraft, influence medical treatment, and determine the timing of major religious rituals. Kings would delay military campaigns if a troubling dream suggested unfavorable omens were gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. Farmers wouldn't plant their crops if they had dreamed of goats flying across the sky, because flying goats were universally understood to be bad news for agricultural ventures. The ancient world operated on the fundamental belief that the universe was constantly trying to communicate with humanity through the medium of sleep. It was humanity's responsibility to listen carefully, interpret correctly, and respond appropriately to these divine messages, even when they arrived in the form of bizarre imagery that challenged logical interpretation. Professional dream interpreters, known as Baru priests, functioned as the ancient equivalent of Freudian analysts, but with considerably more religious authority and significantly less comfortable furniture. They were trained extensively in vast libraries of omen texts, including the famous Ishkar Zak, an elaborate dream manual that categorized thousands of possible dream scenarios and their corresponding meanings with sometimes absurd but eerily precise specificity. The logic of these ancient dream interpretations followed patterns that were both rigorous and completely alien to modern thinking. Dreaming of eating dates was considered a favorable omen, suggesting prosperity and sweetness in your future. Dreaming of your teeth falling out, however, was a clear warning to expect death in the family, an interpretation that has somehow survived across millennia and still appears in modern dream dictionaries. Dreaming of intimate encounters with goddesses was interpreted with particular care, as it could indicate either divine favor and blessing or dangerous arrogance that might attract unwanted attention from jealous deities. These dream interpretation guides didn't present themselves as offering educated guesses or psychological insights. They functioned more like mathematical equations, presenting clear cause and effect relationships between dream imagery and future events. See a snake in your dream, and you should prepare for betrayal from someone close to you. Fall from a rooftop in your sleep, and a lawsuit was almost certainly heading your way. The dream world operated according to divine logic, which was far stranger and more complex than human reasoning, but it was logic nonetheless, with rules that could be learned, patterns that could be recognized, and warnings that could be heeded by those wise enough to pay attention. But ancient civilizations didn't limit themselves to passive interpretation of whatever dreams happened to occur naturally. They also practiced deliberate dream incubation, actively seeking specific guidance from the gods through carefully orchestrated sleeping rituals. If a ruler needed divine advice about a military campaign, a diplomatic marriage, or a religious controversy, he might arrange to sleep in a temple under precisely controlled spiritual conditions. This involved extensive preparation, ritual fasting to purify the body, ceremonial cleansing to prepare the spirit, carefully chosen incense offerings to attract divine attention, and sometimes the sacrifice of valuable animals to demonstrate the seriousness of the request. The idea behind dream incubation was that certain sacred environments could strengthen and clarify the connection between human consciousness and divine communication. Temples were believed to be particularly effective locations for receiving clear, unambiguous messages from the gods, partly because of their spiritual significance, and partly because they were designed to minimize the kinds of earthly distractions that might interfere with celestial messaging. The goal was to create conditions where divine revelations could flow freely into the sleeping mind, unfiltered by the usual chaos of daily concerns and bodily discomforts. For these ancient civilizations, the dream world wasn't a psychological curiosity to be analyzed or a biological function to be explained. It was a parallel realm of existence where gods, spirits, and cosmic forces could interact directly with human consciousness, offering guidance, warnings, blessings, and occasionally harsh corrections for those who had strayed from proper behavior. Dreams provided access to hidden knowledge, future events, and divine intentions that were otherwise completely inaccessible to waking consciousness. This understanding of dreams as divine communication shaped every aspect of ancient life, from personal decisions about marriage and career to major policy choices that affected entire civilizations. Dreams influenced military strategy, agricultural planning, religious practices, and social customs. They were woven so thoroughly into the fabric of ancient existence that it's difficult to imagine how these societies might have functioned without their nightly access to supernatural guidance. The Mesopotamians believed that the gods were always speaking, constantly offering wisdom, warnings, and instructions to anyone wise enough to listen. The only requirement was that you had to be asleep to hear them clearly, because the busy, conscious mind was apparently too cluttered with everyday concerns to receive divine messages effectively. Sleep became a form of prayer, a nightly opportunity to commune with forces beyond human understanding and to receive guidance that could illuminate even the most challenging problems. From these ancient temples where people slept in hopes of divine guidance, we move toward another form of liquid wisdom that shaped civilizations and connected humanity to the sacred realm through fermentation rather than dreams. In ancient Egypt, dreams weren't merely nightly occurrences that disappeared with the morning light. They were considered sacred texts in motion, divine manuscripts written across the landscape of sleep by gods, ancestors, and even by one's own Ka, the spiritual double that existed alongside every living person. Every dream, whether pleasant or terrifying, beautiful or disturbing, arrived with clear intent and purpose. It could warn of approaching danger, bestow divine blessings, provide crucial instructions for navigating life's challenges, or deliver terrifying messages about cosmic displeasure that required immediate attention and appropriate ritual response. By the time of the New Kingdom, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, when Egyptian civilization had reached unprecedented heights of sophistication and cultural complexity, the Egyptians had begun systematically recording their dream interpretations in what would become some of history's earliest and most comprehensive dream manuals. One of the most famous and detailed examples is the Ramesside Dream Book, meticulously written on papyrus and discovered in the village of Deir el-Medina, the settlement where the skilled craftsmen who built and decorated the royal tombs lived and worked. This wasn't casual bedtime reading or entertainment for the curious. The Ramesside Dream Book functioned as a divine diagnostic tool, a sacred reference manual that listed hundreds of specific dream scenarios alongside their corresponding interpretations, each one categorized with mathematical precision based on whether the predicted outcome would be favorable to the dreamer or would bring disaster, misfortune, or divine punishment. A logic behind these interpretations was not always immediately intuitive to modern minds, but it was deeply rooted in Egyptian cosmology, religious symbolism, and thousands of years of accumulated spiritual wisdom. For example, if a man saw himself eating crocodile flesh in a dream, the interpretation was remarkably specific and optimistic. It meant he would soon become a high official, ascending to positions of power and influence within the complex bureaucracy that governed Egyptian society. This might seem like a strange connection to make, but in Egyptian religious thinking, the crocodile was intimately connected to Sobek, the powerful god who embodied strength, fertility, and royal authority. To dream of consuming crocodile meat was to symbolically absorb divine attributes associated with leadership and power, which naturally translated into predictions of career advancement and social elevation. Each entry in these dream interpretation manuals followed a standardized format that began with the phrase, "If a man sees himself," followed by a detailed description of the symbolic scenario that had played out during sleep. These weren't vague generalizations or loose guidelines that could be adapted to different circumstances. They were specific, detailed predictions drawn from centuries of ritual knowledge, personal visions recorded by priests and scholars, and temple traditions that had been carefully preserved and passed down through generations of religious practitioners. The interpretations themselves were often starkly binary, marked in red and black ink to clearly distinguish between dreams that predicted good fortune and those that warned of approaching catastrophe. Red ink indicated positive outcomes, prosperity, health, divine favor, successful endeavors, and protection from enemies. Black ink marked the dangerous dreams, the ones that warned of illness, betrayal, financial ruin, family disasters, or the displeasure of gods who might require immediate appeasement through offerings, rituals, or significant changes in behavior. Sup. If your dream fell into the black ink category, if it was classified as genuinely dangerous rather than merely unpleasant, it was time to take immediate action. This might involve lighting specific types of incense in temple ceremonies, seeking intervention from priests who specialized in dream-related spiritual emergencies, performing protective rituals, or making substantial offerings to whichever deity seemed most likely to be expressing displeasure through your nocturnal visions. Priests working in temple complexes dedicated to healing deities like Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of medicine and divine retribution, or Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and sacred knowledge, sometimes offered specialized services in dream incubation. This practice involved creating carefully controlled spiritual environments where supplicants could sleep within the temple precincts and await specific guidance, healing visions, or direct divine intervention in their problems. The process of temple dream incubation was elaborate and spiritually demanding. It began with purification rituals that might last for days, involving ritual bathing, dietary restrictions, confession of sins or spiritual transgressions, and prayers designed to cleanse both body and spirit of anything that might interfere with clear divine communication. Only after achieving the proper state of spiritual purity could the supplicant be permitted to sleep in the temple's designated sleeping chambers, special rooms designed specifically for receiving divine visions. This wasn't merely superstition or primitive psychology masquerading as religion. For the ancient Egyptians, dream incubation represented a sophisticated integration of healthcare, divination, and theology, all rolled into a single night's rest under divine supervision. The goal was to open a direct communication channel between human consciousness and the realm of the gods, allowing divine wisdom to flow freely into the sleeping mind without interference from earthly concerns or spiritual impurities. Dreams also played crucial roles in magical practices and medical treatment throughout Egyptian society. Protective amulets might be specifically prescribed to ward off recurring nightmares that were believed to be caused by malevolent spirits, hostile magic, or the restless dead who were attempting to interfere with the living. Certain dreams were considered so dangerous that they required immediate spiritual erasure, elaborate rituals designed to neutralize the dream's power and prevent it from manifesting in the physical world. These dream-erasing ceremonies were taken extremely seriously because Egyptians believed that dreams existed in a liminal space between the spiritual and physical realms, and that particularly powerful or dangerous visions could actually influence material reality if left unchecked. A nightmare about illness could potentially cause actual sickness if not properly neutralized. A dream about family disasters could set destructive forces in motion unless appropriate protective measures were taken immediately. The medical papyri that have survived from ancient Egypt often include detailed instructions for interpreting dreams as diagnostic tools for physical ailments. Physicians were trained to recognize dream symbols that might indicate specific health problems long before physical symptoms became apparent. A dream of flowing water might suggest developing kidney problems that required immediate treatment. Dreams of being crushed or suffocated could point to chest ailments or respiratory issues that needed medical attention. Dreams of darkness or blindness might warn of eye problems or other sensory difficulties. This integration of dream interpretation with practical medicine reflected the Egyptian understanding that human beings existed simultaneously in multiple realms of reality, and that maintaining health required attention to spiritual and psychological well-being alongside physical care. Dreams provided a window into the hidden aspects of health and illness, revealing problems that might not yet be visible to ordinary medical examination, but were already being recognized by the deeper, more intuitive aspects of human consciousness. For the ancient Egyptians, the sleeping mind was never idle or unproductive. Instead, it functioned as an active participant in a vast spiritual ecosystem where gods, demons, ancestors, and the spirits of the dead could appear to offer glimpses into hidden truths, provide guidance for difficult decisions, deliver warnings about approaching dangers, or simply remind the living that they existed within a cosmos far more complex and mysterious than anything visible during waking hours. The Egyptian approach to dreams recognized that human consciousness operated on multiple levels simultaneously, and that the rational, analytical mind that dominated during waking hours was only one instrument in a much larger orchestra of awareness. Dreams provided access to wisdom that transcended ordinary logic, knowledge that came not from books or teachers, but from direct contact with the divine forces that shaped reality itself. This understanding would profoundly influence later civilizations, creating interpretive traditions that would spread throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, carrying forward the fundamental insight that dreams represent something far more significant than random neurological activity, something that connects human experience to larger patterns of meaning and purpose that continue to shape our understanding of consciousness, spirituality, and the mysterious relationship between sleeping and waking life. As these sophisticated Egyptian dream traditions flourished along the Nile, other ancient civilizations were developing their own approaches to understanding the messages that arrived each night through sleep, creating a rich tapestry of dream interpretation that would influence human culture for thousands of years to come. The earliest known beer didn't arrive in a frosty mug with condensation beading on the sides, or in a bottle with an attractive label proclaiming its artisanal origins. It emerged from a humble clay pot sitting in the dusty courtyard of a Sumerian village thousands of years ago, long before Rome had even dreamed of its future empire. Long before the pyramids cast their shadows across Egyptian sands, when human civilization was still young and the art of transforming grain into liquid sustenance was considered nothing short of miraculous. Beer in Sumerian society wasn't simply a casual beverage that people reached for when they wanted something refreshing. It was simultaneously a staple food that provided essential nutrition, a form of currency that could be traded for goods and services, a sacred offering presented to the gods during religious ceremonies, and a powerful symbol of civilization itself, representing humanity's mastery over nature and the mysterious processes of transformation. It's no historical accident that the oldest written recipe in all of human history isn't instructions for baking bread or preparing soup, but detailed directions for brewing beer, preserved for posterity on clay tablets dating back to around 1800 BCE. This ancient recipe took the form of the Hymn to Ninkasi, a remarkable document that served dual purposes with elegant efficiency. On one level, it functioned as a religious praise song dedicated to Ninkasi, the revered goddess who presided over all aspects of beer production, from the growing of barley to the final fermentation that transformed ordinary grain into something approaching the divine. On another level, it provided precise, step-by-step brewing instructions disguised as poetry, allowing sacred knowledge to be preserved, transmitted, and memorized through the power of verse and repetition. Ninkasi wasn't treated as a minor deity relegated to the margins of religious practice. She occupied a central position in the Sumerian pantheon, commanding genuine reverence and elaborate ritual attention. To brew beer was to invoke her divine presence, to participate in a sacred act that connected human craftsmanship with supernatural power. The brewing process itself was understood as both practical chemistry and spiritual communion, a transformation that could only occur through the combined efforts of human skill and divine blessing. The actual brewing techniques employed by these ancient Sumerians were both remarkably sophisticated and charmingly primitive by modern standards. The process began with the creation of a special bread called bapir, made primarily from barley, but often enriched with honey for sweetness or dates for additional flavor complexity. This bread wasn't intended for eating in the conventional sense, though it was perfectly edible and nutritious. Instead, it served as a concentrated source of fermentable sugars that could be easily stored, transported, and transformed into beer whenever the need arose. The bapir was carefully crumbled into large ceramic jars filled with water, creating a thick, porridge-like mixture that bore little resemblance to anything we might recognize as beer today. This mixture was then left to ferment naturally, relying on wild yeasts that existed in the air, in the pottery vessels themselves, or on the grain to trigger the magical process of transformation that would convert starches into alcohol and create the bubbling aromatic brew that would sustain communities for thousands of years. The resulting beverage was thick, cloudy, and remarkably low in alcohol content compared to modern beer, resembling something closer to a nutritious gruel than the clear, sparkling beverages we associate with brewing today. But this apparent crudeness was actually a feature rather than a flaw, because this beer served purposes that went far beyond simple intoxication or recreational drinking. It was rich in calories, packed with vitamins and minerals, and provided essential nutrition for people whose diets were often limited by seasonal availability and economic constraints. Water quality in the ancient world was frequently questionable at best and genuinely dangerous at worst. contaminated with bacteria, parasites, and other microscopic threats that could cause serious illness or death. Beer, thanks to its fermentation process and modest alcohol content, was significantly safer to drink than water drawn directly from rivers, wells, or other natural sources. The brewing process effectively sterilized the liquid, creating a beverage that could be consumed with confidence, even when other drinks might pose serious health risks. More than just safety, beer became the foundation of social and economic systems throughout the ancient world. Workers engaged in major construction projects, including the building of temples, irrigation systems, and urban infrastructure, were frequently paid partly in beer rations that could amount to several liters per day. These weren't excessive amounts designed to keep workers intoxicated and compliant, but carefully calculated portions that provided necessary calories, hydration, and nutrition for people engaged in physically demanding labor under challenging conditions. The social significance of beer consumption extended far beyond its nutritional value. Rather than drinking from individual containers as we do today, ancient peoples often gathered around large ceramic vessels and shared beer through long reed straws that filtered out sediment and grain particles while allowing the liquid to flow freely. This communal drinking wasn't simply about getting drunk together, though that certainly happened on occasion. It was about creating and reinforcing social bonds, establishing trust, marking important occasions, and demonstrating that despite the harsh realities of ancient life, there was still room for pleasure, celebration, and human connection. Beer was also deeply embedded in religious and spiritual practices throughout the ancient world. It appeared in temple offerings, funeral preparations, and seasonal celebrations that marked the agricultural cycles upon which ancient societies depended. The transformation of grain into beer was seen as a miracle that paralleled other sacred transformations: the changing of seasons, the growth of crops, the cycle of life and death that governed both human existence and the natural world. These brewing traditions weren't confined to Mesopotamia, but spread throughout the ancient world, adapting to local ingredients, climate conditions, and cultural preferences, while maintaining their essential character as both practical sustenance and sacred ritual. Each civilization that embraced beer brewing developed its own variations, techniques, and ceremonial practices, but the fundamental understanding remained consistent. Beer was liquid civilization, a tangible demonstration of humanity's ability to transform raw materials into something greater than the sum of its parts. The brewing process required knowledge, skill, patience, and cooperation among multiple people working toward a common goal. It necessitated planning ahead, storing grain through difficult seasons, maintaining equipment, and coordinating timing with agricultural cycles. These requirements encouraged the development of stable communities, specialized labor, and the kind of long-term thinking that would eventually lead to complex urban civilizations. Beer production also fostered technological innovation and scientific observation. Even though ancient brewers didn't understand the biochemistry underlying their craft, they learned through careful observation and experimentation which techniques produced better results, how to control fermentation, how to achieve consistent quality, and how to adapt their methods to different ingredients and environmental conditions. This accumulated knowledge was passed down through generations, refined through countless brewing sessions, and eventually codified in written instructions like the Hymn to Ninkasi. The economic impact of beer extended far beyond individual consumption to influence trade networks, taxation systems, and resource allocation throughout ancient societies. Regions with surplus grain and advanced brewing knowledge could trade their beer and brewing expertise with neighboring areas, creating economic relationships that strengthened political alliances and cultural exchange. The need for brewing ingredients and equipment encouraged trade in clay pottery, metal tools, and exotic flavoring agents that enhanced both the taste and the prestige of finished beer. Women played crucial roles in early beer production, often serving as the primary brewers in both domestic and temple settings. This wasn't simply because brewing was considered domestic work, but because it required the kind of detailed attention, timing, and intuitive understanding that ancient societies associated with feminine wisdom and spiritual insight. Female brewers were often highly respected members of their communities, possessing valuable knowledge and skills that made them indispensable to the survival and prosperity of their families and villages. As ancient civilizations grew more complex and stratified, beer production became increasingly sophisticated and specialized. What had begun as a simple household activity gradually evolved into an industry involving professional brewers, specialized equipment, quality control measures, and regulatory oversight. Different styles of beer emerged to serve different social classes and occasions. From basic nutritional brews for workers to refined, flavored varieties reserved for religious ceremonies and elite consumption. The legacy of these ancient brewing traditions extends far beyond historical curiosity to influence modern understanding of fermentation, nutrition, food safety, and the social roles that alcoholic beverages play in human culture. Archaeological evidence of ancient brewing techniques has provided insights into early agricultural practices, urban planning, religious beliefs, and economic systems that shaped the development of human civilization. Every time we raise a glass of beer today, we're participating in a ritual that connects us directly to those ancient Sumerian villages where people first discovered the transformative power of fermentation. We're continuing a tradition that has survived wars, famines, religious upheavals, and technological revolutions, demonstrating the enduring human need for beverages that provide not just nutrition and pleasure, but also social connection and symbolic meaning. From these ancient brewing traditions that help build the foundations of civilization, we move toward understanding how the echoes of these discoveries continue to influence modern life, carrying forward wisdom and practices that remain relevant thousands of years after the first clay pot of beer bubbled in a Mesopotamian courtyard. Though the ancient temples have crumbled into dust and the priests who once interpreted divine dreams now sleep beneath layers of earth and time, the legacy of these forgotten traditions continues to whisper through our modern world, threading its way through science, psychology, and the quiet moments of daily life when we pause to recognize connections that span millennia. Much of what we believe today about dreams, our fascination with symbolism and recurring motifs, even our approach to nightmares and their meanings, traces its roots back to those ancient frameworks that first attempted to make sense of the sleeping mind and the mysterious realm it inhabited each night. The medieval world inherited these interpretive traditions almost wholesale, carrying forward the fundamental belief that sleep represented something far more significant than mere rest. Islamic scholars translated the dream interpretation manuals of ancient civilizations into Arabic, refining and expanding upon them with their own insights and observations. In Islamic mysticism, dreams became deeply respected as reliable means of divine guidance, continuing the ancient tradition of viewing sleep as a portal to supernatural wisdom. Meanwhile, Christian monks and theologians began systematically cataloging dreams of saints and martyrs, recording visions that often predicted future miracles or warned of divine justice, maintaining the same essential structure that had governed dream interpretation for thousands of years. Fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries, and we encounter Sigmund Freud, who, despite his conscious rejection of religious interpretations of dreams, borrowed heavily from the symbolic frameworks pioneered by ancient civilizations. In his groundbreaking work, The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1899, Freud argued that dreams expressed repressed desires, hidden fears, and unconscious conflicts, but his analytical methods still relied on the same fundamental tools that ancient dream interpreters had used: metaphor, symbol, narrative structure, and the assumption that dream imagery carried meanings that transcended their surface appearance. His protege Carl Jung went even further in connecting modern psychology to ancient wisdom, describing the dream world as populated by universal archetypes, timeless figures like the shadow, the hero, the wise old man, and the great mother that appeared across cultures and throughout history. These Jungian archetypes bore striking resemblances to the divine figures, mythological characters, and symbolic entities that ancient dream interpreters had recognized in the visions of their contemporaries thousands of years earlier. Even modern neuroscience, while stripping dreams of their mystical associations and explaining them in terms of brain chemistry and neural activity, continues to respect their complexity and significance. Research into REM sleep, lucid dreaming, and the influence of trauma and memory on dream content echoes ancient notions that dreams reflect both the health of the body and the state of the soul, that what we experience during sleep provides valuable insights into our waking lives and psychological well-being. Popular culture carries forward this torch with remarkable consistency. From horror films based on sleep paralysis to dream journal apps promising self-discovery, from tarot cards to New Age spirituality, the ancient idea continues to pulse beneath contemporary life. What we see in sleep matters, carries meaning, and deserves careful attention. Whether it's a blockbuster movie about entering other people's dreams, or a simple meditation app that encourages dream recording, modern entertainment and wellness industries continue to profit from humanity's enduring fascination with the mystery of sleep and the possibility that our nocturnal visions contain important messages. Similarly, the brewing traditions that began in ancient Sumerian villages continue to influence modern life in ways both obvious and subtle. Every craft brewery that emphasizes traditional methods, every beer festival that celebrates historical styles, every home brewer who experiments with ancient grains and wild fermentation techniques participates in a direct lineage that stretches back to those first clay pots bubbling in Mesopotamian courtyards. The social rituals surrounding beer consumption, the gathering of friends around shared drinks, the use of alcohol to mark celebrations and significant life events, all echo the communal practices that made beer central to ancient civilizations. Even the medieval approach to food and cooking influences contemporary culinary culture. The farm-to-table movement, with its emphasis on local ingredients and seasonal availability, mirrors the medieval necessity of working with whatever grew nearby. The current fascination with fermented foods, artisanal cheeses, and traditional preservation methods reflects a return to techniques that medieval cooks mastered out of necessity. Food trucks and street vendors selling handheld meals continue the tradition of portable eating that made meat pasties so popular among medieval workers and travelers. Modern experimental archaeology projects have successfully recreated ancient beer recipes, medieval cooking techniques, and historical food preservation methods, offering contemporary people literal tastes of history. Museums and heritage sites around the world now feature working medieval kitchens, functioning breweries, and demonstrations of ancient crafts that allow visitors to experience these traditions directly rather than simply reading about them in textbooks. Perhaps most importantly, these ancient traditions remind us that human nature itself hasn't fundamentally changed, despite all our technological advances and cultural evolution. We still crave connection, still seek meaning in our experiences, still find pleasure in simple things like shared meals and good drinks. We still wonder about our dreams, still look for signs and patterns in the events of our lives, still need rituals and celebrations that mark important moments and transitions. The medieval baker who carefully prepared apple fritters for market day and the modern food truck operator crafting artisanal donuts are separated by centuries, but united by the same desire to transform basic ingredients into something that brings joy to other people. The ancient priest interpreting dreams in a Mesopotamian temple, and the modern therapist helping patients understand their recurring nightmares, share a fundamental belief that the human mind contains depths worth exploring and wisdom worth discovering. Every time you bite into something sweet and fried, every time you raise a glass with friends, every time you close your eyes and drift towards sleep wondering what dreams might come, you're participating in rituals that connect you directly to ancestors you'll never know, but whose experiences and insights continue to shape your own. The medieval cook who perfected the art of making cheese curds squeak, and the modern artisan cheesemaker experimenting with traditional techniques are part of the same continuous story of human creativity and persistence. In our age of instant communication and global connectivity, it's easy to forget that the most fundamental human experiences, eating, drinking, sleeping, dreaming, remain essentially unchanged. These ancient traditions survived not because they were primitive or quaint, but because they addressed needs and desires that transcend time and culture. They remind us that beneath all our modern complexity, we remain connected to the earth, to natural cycles, to each other, and to mysteries that technology can't solve. So the next time you raise a glass of beer, take a moment to remember that you're continuing a tradition that helped build civilization itself. When you close your eyes to sleep tonight, remember that you're entering a realm that our ancestors considered sacred, a place where wisdom and wonder still await those patient enough to listen. In every simple pleasure, every moment of connection, every taste of something delicious, the echo of ancient wisdom whispers, "This is what it means to be human." And as we close this gentle journey through forgotten flavors and ancient dreams, I hope these stories have brought you the same comfort they've brought countless generations before us. From medieval apple fritters sizzling in century-old fat to the sacred dreams that guided entire civilizations, these tales remind us that human nature, our need for sweetness, connection, and meaning, remains beautifully unchanged. If you found peace in tonight's stories, if these whispered histories help quiet your mind, please consider subscribing to join our community of nighttime wanderers. We gather here regularly to explore the forgotten corners of history, the gentle mysteries that don't demand your energy, but offer something softer, understanding, wonder, and the kind of wisdom that comes only through time. Hit that like button if these medieval kitchens and ancient temples felt like a warm embrace for your restless thoughts. And ring the notification bell, not for urgent alerts, but for quiet invitations to return whenever you need refuge from the noise of modern life. Next week, we'll drift through the secret gardens of Renaissance Italy, where monks grew herbs that could heal both body and spirit. Until then, may your own dreams be filled with the simple pleasures our ancestors knew so well: the comfort of shared bread, the mystery of sleep, and the eternal human search for sweetness in an often bitter world. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers. History will be here waiting when you're ready to wander again.